Now, on Book TV's Afterwards, New York Times Magazine contributor Thomas Chatterton Williams looks at race and identity. He's interviewed by author and New York Times columnist Kwame Anthony Appiah. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work. All Afterwards programs are also available as podcasts.
So they've introduced us and they've told them who we are, so we can just start talking about your wonderful new book. And I think the best way to do that is to talk about its author, because it's a book that makes an argument that depends on the life of the author, and so we need to know a little bit about who you are. I'm sure lots of people do already, but just in case, let's talk a bit about that. And anyway, you might want to talk about how you think about your own life. So let's start with, you grew up in New Jersey.
That's right. Yeah.
And you grew up, how did your parents get to New Jersey, and who were they?
So I'm the son of a black man from the segregated South. My father's 82 years old. He was born in 1937 in Longview, Texas, and raised in Galveston under segregation, under Jim Crow. And he moved to the West as soon as he could and was running war on poverty programs under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiative. And he met my mother, who's 9 years his junior, in San Diego, where he was heading up war on poverty program. And she was fresh out of college. And she is the daughter of evangelical Christians. Her father was a minister. And he was very much a part of this mainstream American society that was certainly opposed to interracial marriage in the late 1960s, early 1970s.
So you didn't use the word white about him, but he was...
Yeah, he's white. I should specify that. My mother is white.
Yes, right.
And he was really unhappy when my parents got together, and so they eventually moved up to Oregon and Washington State and then Denver, and my father's jobs kept taking them east and until 1981 when I was born in New Jersey. Okay,
so and the job in New Jersey, what was he doing? Still the same sort of thing?
By the time that I was born, my father was he was running SAT preparation. He was tutoring students who would come to the house and study privately with him for the SAT, the GRE, the LSAT within subjects, math and science, and that's how he was supporting the family. And so my brother and I became kind of like captive live-in students in this house that was just very small, a very modest one-story ranch house, but it was packed from wall to wall with books. He had about 15,000 books.
Good Lord.
And so we studied with him on the weekends and in the evenings and through our summer breaks. And that's basically what made up for the kind of mediocre interparochial Catholic schools that we were going to.
Why did you go to Catholic school?
For a variety of reasons. I think my father kind of believed that the discipline would be better there, though it really wasn't. I think that he wanted to get us out of our neighborhood. We lived in a kind of informally segregated part of New Jersey where there was a white side of town and a black side of town.
What's the town?
I grew up in Fanwood, New Jersey. And so as a kind of silent protest against the realtors' attempts to steer us to the black pocket, we lived on the white side of town. And that came with in the 1980s and 90s, that came with some racial dynamics that my father wanted to get us out of. So we went to a Catholic school a couple towns over.
And but not, as it were, in order to become Catholics?
Not at all. In fact, my father's an atheist and my mother is a Protestant.
Right.
And so when the school would go to Mass, my brother and I would sit back and we would read our books. And that was kind of an early experience of standing apart from
you mentioned
the
that in the book. So how, was it just you two? I mean, was it a very significant difference from all the others to be just the two of you?
Yeah, it was just us two. No one else.
No one else had
not
that.
A single
Wow.
other person abstained from going to Mass.
Right. And is that because they were mostly from Catholic families?
Most were. I wasn't even aware of meeting children of other faiths outside of Christianity until I got to Georgetown in 1999.
So you went to Catholic college?
And ended up going to a Jesuit school.
Jesuit school.
Yeah. In retrospect, I realized it wasn't until I got to grad school at NYU that I had been outside of Catholic education.
At all?
Yeah.
And how did it go? You said it wasn't it sounds as though you think you got the best part of your education at home, which
absolutely,
may be true of a lot of people. But what happened in the school? It seemed. I mean, first of all, I mean, since we're going to be talking about race,
Sure.
What's the composition of the school population?
So my mother is technically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but she's not what people think of when they think of that as connoting some type of social elite. Her faith is Protestant, and she's derived from Anglo-Saxon stock, but that's about as far as that goes. So that was my experience with that kind of whiteness, and I grew up in New Jersey around what my parents would refer to as ethnic whites, Polish kids, Italian kids, Irish kids, Greek kids. And so that was my experience with whiteness, even Portuguese and Spanish kids. So they tended to be Catholic. They tended, once I got to college, I realized they tended not to be at all this kind of elite white.
Right. They were not college-bound.
Many of them were not. Many of them were not. Yeah.
And these are the kids in your neighborhood, but also the kids in your school.
That's right.
So is it, what percentage of the kids in your school would have been black?
So up until high school, I was one of a handful of black students, and was really aware that I could interpret and perform my racial identity as I kind of wanted to, because there wasn't much basis of judging.
Okay.
By the time I got to high school, and it was a deliberate choice, I chose to go to a school that was much more black and Latino, probably about half.
You were offered a choice.
Yeah, my father offered me a choice.
One of two.
I could have gone to a pretty good all-boys Catholic school that would have been pretty white and had a very good basketball team, and I was obsessed with basketball. But I very much wanted to be in a social milieu with black girls to date, and so I chose to go to a school that was inferior in terms of academics and in terms of basketball. But I believed that I was good enough at basketball to make up for that, and I knew that my father was going to be making me study with him no matter what. So I didn't really worry about my SAT prep. But so I ended up going to a school that was heavily black and Latino as well as ethnic white.
Mm-hmm. And not Catholic.
It was Catholic.
It was Catholic.
It was Catholic.
Okay, so all the options are Catholic.
All the options were still Catholic.
So that must have been something about the neighborhood and the town. And you, how serious were you about your basketball? I mean,
I was pretty serious until there was a conflict with potentially leaving the school and leaving my high school girlfriend behind to go and play somewhere else. I was serious enough that I tried out a few times with St. Anthony's in Jersey City under Bobby Hurley, and the tryouts went well, and he invited me to. I could have transferred schools there and tried my luck at being on the team when I was 15, 16. But at the last moment, I decided I couldn't. I didn't have a desire to leave this girl that I was madly in love with, that kind of was enormously influential in my kind of racial self-conception, as well as my kind of...
Right, so you talk about that in the book. Tell us a bit about what that means, because in a way, your experience of blackness in the household is let's say, eccentric, unusual.
Yeah.
But she was your kind of access to what you might call normal blackness.
Yeah, so part of what I realized in retrospect was different about my family was that my father was fleeing the segregated South in many ways, a Texas upbringing that caused some pain. And my mother was fleeing a kind of stifling racism coming from her own father, and they were searching to create their own family on their own terms. And so my brother and I were raised outside of the context of extended family members on either our black or white side. Oh. So our house was really, we were a foursome unto ourselves. And I didn't realize how different that was from all of my friends until I became an adult, until I became a parent, and I saw, for example, how many cousins my children have and how important extended family is to them. So my racial identity was really kind of always coming directly from my father, but also from my mother's. My mother agreed with his idea that a drop of black blood makes a person black. My mother agreed that we were a black household. So my brother and I grew up with a white mom and a black dad, but it wasn't that complicated a question for us. We were black. The white kids we knew didn't think we were white, and the black kids basically were used to black people looking all kinds of ways. So I had a kind of uncomplicated sense of myself as black, but I realized that depending on how I behaved, how I dressed, how I comported myself, my blackness others could perceive a more authentic or a less authentic racial identity. And so I kind of threw myself into the idea that the girl I was with kind kind of was also the fulcrum upon which I hoisted up my sense of myself.
So who was she?
So she's a girl I refer to as Stacy in both of the memoirs. She was a year younger than me. She was actually from a household that was pretty middle class, but she was in the neighboring black town of Plainfield, which was a slightly less affluent town. And she lived around a more of an inner city experience, even though she was not directly in that. And she kind of exuded a kind of intoxicating cool that I, that it was shocking to me. I mean, here was a girl that didn't ever take the SAT test, wasn't concerned about it. It wasn't. No one asked her to. No one told her to. You know, she cut school. She seemed extraordinarily free, and just not.
What was her life plan? What was she?
She didn't have one.
She didn't have one.
She didn't have
one.
She
didn't need one.
She needed one.
She thought
she needed one, but she didn't have one. And there was a spell when I was a senior and she was a junior. My father took her aside and tried to prepare her on his own for free for the SATs, and he was astounded. I mean, I think she was one of the first kids he ever worked with where he just couldn't reach her. She just
didn't care.
Didn't care. Yeah. I think she exuded what Orlando Patterson might call like a cool pose culture. You know, she exemplified that.
Right. And that was attractive.
At the time, it was really attractive to me. It was very exotic to me. It was very different from... She was completely outside of the context I was growing up in at home, but I was also really trying my best to lead a kind of double life. I didn't really share the kind of home life I had with in my social context at school and on the basketball courts.
So they didn't know that you were studying at the weekends as well?
Most of them didn't really understand what was going on, and it was kind of a shock to many of my friends when senior year rolled around, and then I had invitations to go to some schools that I don't think that they ever knew I was preparing to go to. And
now you said that you didn't have the kind of extended family that you might have had if there hadn't been good reasons for your father not to want to go to the segregated South and your mother not to want to hang out with a family that wasn't super happy about her being married to a black man.
I should specify that my grandmother was the opposite. She was really not at all a racist, and she would come and visit us every year. Yeah, she came to us, but I've only in retrospect realized that her husband could have come but never did and never called. You know, he was really absent, but she made the effort to come. So I knew my maternal grandmother.
Right. But you knew her in your place.
Yeah, that's right, not in her place.
Right. And so you didn't get to know the people, I mean, her other grandchildren, for example, in the way that you would have.
Knew them from afar.
I mean, you knew who they were.
Not in a way that impacted my sense of myself.
Right. They weren't
That's right.
close in any way. So your circle, I mean, all young people have a circle of people that they define themselves by, even if they don't have family. So who were your,
Mine was
apart from your girlfriend, who were the others?
So I had a best friend I called Charles in the book, and his mother was Puerto Rican and his father Black American. And he was one of these kids that just extraordinarily smart, things came easy to him, really good looking, really popular. And somehow very early on he latched on to me and started coming home, because I lived much closer to school than he did, started coming home with me in the afternoons, saw my father, saw what my father had access to through all of these books, and saw that there was some type of life of the mind that he hadn't seen elsewhere, and said, I want to participate in that. He was like the opposite of my high school girlfriend, and so he started coming over the house every day, and so that helped me. The two of us studied every day from freshman year through senior year for our SATs and did extra prep work outside of our classes, and he ended up making a huge success of himself. He ended up, he did a little bit worse on the SAT, went to a slightly lesser college, studied very hard, got straight A's, studied abroad at Oxford, then went to the top law school in the country, then worked at one of the top investment banks, and then, he made a smashing success out of himself, and I think that his encounter with my father was transformative for him. So that was something that it was really, we were like brothers. But he was also a code switcher, and he was extraordinarily cool, and most people didn't know that that's what he was doing either.
Okay. Were you code switching? Were you?
I was trying my best. I was trying my best to. So my life depended. I felt like my social life depended.
Okay.
On it. Yeah.
And so you think you sort of had a sense that there was a way you were at home that just wasn't going to work.
It didn't translate into what I felt my peers would value. Although, in retrospect, I also want to say that perhaps I was projecting that on them, and perhaps they could have handled a lot more than I was willing to share with them. And I really don't know. I felt as though I had to hide that.
Right. And so did your friend.
He did too, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was a shared judgment.
Yeah. I mean, I have one memory of having done well on the SAT 2 writing exam. I got a perfect score, and the principal wanted on the closed circuit TV to honor me, and I got so afraid that everyone was going to tease me and it was going to make me uncool, and I went, and he did the thing, and everybody in homeroom watched it, and when I stepped out into the hallway, I braced myself for the teasing, but nothing ever came. No one even acknowledged it one way or the other. It meant nothing to anybody, and that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, because had I had done something well on the basketball court, or had I even just had a really good pair of new tennis shoes, that would have registered much more with everybody, but it meant nothing.
So how many people from your class went to college?
That I'm aware of? It depends. There are very different definitions of college, of course.
Yes. Well, how many of them stopped with high school?
I think
would it have been
quite
half?
a few. I mean, quite a few. I don't really know the numbers, but for example, my girlfriend, she simply got pregnant and never, and that was it. And there were multiple students like that.
Okay. And so what did the school think about this? I mean, surely the school must have had a view about, here you were, you and your friend, you were...
Yeah, the administrators were quite proud. Yeah, the administrators were quite proud.
Right.
And some of them would ask my dad, why is Thomas dating this girl? And things like that, and I would be very defensive about that. And my father was kind of delicately not trying to, put too much pressure on me, but he was concerned as well.
So by the time you go to Georgetown, you're distant, you've separated from...
It took a year after being in college and coming home and realizing that she had gotten pregnant by a guy who was selling drugs in Newark, New Jersey, and she was going to move in with him. And she kind of scolded me the first time. It was an awkward date the first time I was back on break, and she said, those white have you bugging, you're tripping, what's happened to you? And I realized when I came home that there was something that I realized I was able to express about myself and who I really was down at Georgetown that I didn't want to kind of conceal anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we split. It was super painful, but we split, and then I realized that was absolutely kind of the best thing that could happen.
So you're at Georgetown. You've got a bunch of friends. Who are they? And I mean, because you're arriving at Georgetown as a young black student with lots of high scores in academic stuff. You're there because you want to be, because you're intellectually engaged, academically excited. Who are you for the people who meet you?
So I was living on a floor that was pretty diverse. One of my best friends was Ghanaian from New Jersey. And both of our roommates were white, and we lived across the hall from each other, and we kind of spent a lot of time together.
All four of you?
All four of us, but mostly me and my Ghanaian friend Henry. And at first I kind of, I just didn't even pay attention to, I had nothing against my white dorm mates or anything like that, but I kind of moved through the world as though their reality didn't apply to mine and mine didn't apply to them, and I kind of preemptively cut myself off from having any real intimacy with these other students, and I don't know why. I mean, I really threw myself into the segregated tables in the cafeteria. Which, college cafeterias often break down along identity. Sure. And I often went over to Howard with my black friends on weekends and stuff, and just thought that this larger white reality was something that I swam in, but it had nothing to do with me. I wasn't of it. And one night I was really ill in the dormitory, and I was having an asthma attack, and I went to take a shower in the middle of the night, and I was coming back, and there was one student on the floor who was still awake, and he was 2 doors down from mine, and he invited me in to have some tea. He was listening to jazz, and he was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn named Matt. And I realized that night it was the first time that I had ever really talked to him. We'd lived next to each other for about 6 months, and he was playing music that I'd never really paid attention to. My friends and I growing up, we kind of behaved as though black culture began in the 1970s in the Bronx with hip-hop, and that there was nothing that preceded it. None of us listened to jazz. None of us even really read many books from the
Did
Harlem
your parents
Renaissance or
not
anything
listen
like that.
to?
My dad basically didn't have music on in the house, except for every now and then when he was feeling good, he'd play some James Brown.
Okay.
But I had never really listened to jazz, and so then Matt and I became friends over jazz, and he started introducing me to all these other musicians that I started to love, and I realized that he was the first Jewish guy I'd ever met. You know, I had never been aware of knowing a Jewish guy before, and so then there were Indian guys on the floor, there were people from all over, and I gradually kind of just started realizing that my friend group was much more diverse than I had ever allowed myself to have it in the past, and that I was feeling all the richer for that.
So your Ghanaian friend, though, who was also from New Jersey, was also someone who might have had a more complicated relation to race than some people, because he was connected with an African identity as opposed to 100% rooted in
That's right.
African-American history.
He definitely, in America, was made black, and his social reality would be legible to a lot of other black Americans, but he had linguistic traditions in his house, and like, he put on traditional clothes from time to time, and his family was of modest means, but from time to time they did go back to this other place. They knew where they came from. They didn't have this kind of I think that he had a lot of self-esteem that came from being linked to this other culture. All of his brothers approached school with a kind of, not with the kind of cool post culture that I think took down a lot of my classmates, but they approached it with the kind of tenacity of the immigrant. And all of his brothers went on to become physicians and scientists and things like this. And their family, in one generation, really became successful.
Right. Your talk about his sense of being rooted somewhere makes me want to just step back a moment and ask what your parents, given that your parents took it for granted that you were black, what did they think you should know about black history?
Oh, well, so my father did his best to get me to read James Baldwin, to read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. I mean, to really understand a larger tradition. But he also, somewhat in the way that you write about identity, he always believed that my identity didn't begin or end with the social reality of my blackness. So he kind of had his life saved by being a fatherless black boy in Texas without anyone in his family having an education, but he stumbled upon Plato's Dialogues at some point in his childhood, and he picked it up and he tried his best to read it. And it didn't make sense to him at first, but he was very early on aware that there was something out there that linked him with a towering Greek mind, and that if he could access it, he could potentially access the wider world. And he would read books by himself in his closet with a flashlight, and his family would say, "What are you doing? You're going to get yourself in trouble. Don't read those books." But he, very early on, I mean, Aesop's fables were huge for him. So he would give me, Flaubert and things like this. He always had a sense that you can see yourself in many different places and in many different figures, and so that identity is not just being black. So
you have gone through a phase of thinking that blackness is about sort of being about the cool pose, that kind of.
I had a very narrow understanding of what blackness was.
Even though your father and mother were offering.
I thought he was eccentric.
Okay, and that comes with you to college, but then this experience of a more diverse community of fellow.
And in college, it was the first time that I met black students from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. So college was where I met the children of doctors for the first. But Black America is not just immigrants, and I realized that the black experience was socially and economically a lot more diverse than I had ever known in my little corner of New Jersey. And through getting into jazz and through starting to read Baldwin and starting to read all these other writers more seriously and starting to look at black art, I began to wonder why my friends and I had such a narrow conception of this really rich cultural tradition, and why I thought that my father was somehow outside of this cultural tradition when in many ways he was just exemplifying it.
Right. So now you did write a a book before this, and in that book you were talking in a way about a sense of identity that had to do with this coolness, and then how you came to change your mind about that. So maybe we don't want to spend too long on this, but I mean, I'm just interested in how you think about how you got from as it were, your high school framing of these things through to the college one, through to the one that's in the book, which is slightly different again.
Yeah, I mean, I really grew up believing in the all-American dictum that a drop of black blood makes a person black, primarily because they can never be white, but also because I just accepted that there's something essential about racial identity, and that there are also more and less authentic ways of enacting that identity. And so my first book was a coming-of-age memoir of kind of beginning to question not racial identity, but beginning to question the narrow frame that I came to see was being sold to my generation in the hip-hop era. And it was, my father and I had two very different experiences being black men in America. And I began to, I wanted to write a critique of what I saw as some self-sabotaging values and habits that I certainly participated in, and that the wider social milieu around me did too.
E.g., for example?
For example, the kind of extraordinarily ungenerous way that we interacted with the opposite sex. The way that male-female relations were always kind of a form of getting over on the other, domination. And for example, that became something that I really regretted, and I tried to deal with in the book.
Okay.
But also, extraordinary emphasis on material possessions and success, as opposed to inner freedom and the life of the mind. Not to say that hip hop is some monolith where there aren't brilliant lyrics and a real quest for knowledge, but the mainstream kind of version that we all modeled our identities on was really a kind of minstrelsy that would be really offensive to someone of my dad's generation, actually. And so the book was a rejection of that, but it was not yet a deeper questioning of the racial construct itself. Right. That came later through more life experience.
So you were at that point. What you're doing is taking your being black for granted, but fighting for a different conception of what it is.
That's right.
To be black. And you're, I presume that I should have done the research and looked at the reviews, but I assume that there are people who didn't like that.
That's right. But surprisingly, I did a lot of talks at historically black colleges and in communities, and surprisingly, a lot of black readers, and many who were not necessarily going to college or going to elite colleges, agreed with the book.
Yes.
It was more in elite spaces where the toughest criticism came, and people would say, well, you don't know, white liberals might say, you don't understand the black experience in America, but a lot of blacks came up to me and said, this resonates with me. I do think that we have agency. There are bad choices that go on in the community.
And presumably, within hip-hop culture itself, there is also an anti-sexist strand.
There is. It's not the dominant strand.
Absolutely not.
It's not the most lucrative strand.
No. So in a way, the critique is, you could say, some of the critique, or maybe even a little bit of the critique of the materialism is also in parts of hip-hop. So
absolutely. There's always been that. There's always been that, yeah.
Sort of
and I should stress, the book is not, it's not about music. It's not saying jazz is better than hip-hop. I still listen to hip-hop. It's saying that hip-hop is a means of kind of spreading and glorifying and monetizing this secular religion that kind of impacts people's entire lives.
Right. So we're getting you out of Georgetown. You've got your first degree. You haven't traveled much yet.
That's right.
So you're about to begin to be a little bit more of a world traveler, which presumably is also important in developing your sense of who you are. Let's talk a bit about that. Where did you go? Why did you go? Who did you go with? What happened?
Yeah, I always struggled with the French requirement in school. And the summer before I graduated, to finish my credits, I went and studied for 2 months in Tours. just to get the credits. And what happened was I ended up falling in love with this country. I mean, just the freedom to sit at a cafe, order a glass of wine. I mean, cliche stuff, just to have delicious bread. I had never really been very daring in my culinary pursuits prior to that. I began to taste different things. They were good. I liked it. And I came back from that experience, and at Georgetown I began dating briefly a French exchange student. And we had a really intense relationship for a short amount of time, but during that time, she found me. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't taken the LSATs. I kind of wanted to take a year just working. And she found me a job teaching English in France the next year. By the time that came around, we had broken up. But I said to myself, I've got this job. I've got this interest in this country now, and let me go and see what's out there. And so I lived in this northern town called Lille on the border of Belgium. And it was rainy and gloomy, but I felt a freedom I'd never felt before. I taught English for 10 hours a week. It was an extremely cheap town. I had just enough to pay my rent and to buy, a couple of meals and to cook the rest. And I sat in cafes all day reading Proust. And cliche stuff, but really, really like world-opening things too. And I wondered to myself, I was keeping some notebooks. I said, can I be a writer? Maybe I can try this. And as my year came to an end, my father kind of told me, look, you need to come back home and figure out what you're going to do. So I took the GRE and didn't get into the program that I wanted and decided, I got to get a job. And I went and I was a paralegal for 2 years at a midtown corporate law firm. And I thought maybe I would do that and then I'd go to law school. And it was absolute misery. It was terrible. I've worked a 36-hour day. I've come in on a Tuesday and left on a Thursday from the office. And I decided, I had such bad experiences there that I decided, what? I need to actually try to be a writer. I think that's what I want to do, and I need to try to do that. And so I applied to NYU.
To the writing program.
Yeah, to the writing program, the cultural reporting and criticism program in the journalism school. And I got a fellowship, and it made it possible for me to go. And so then I just approached that as though, with a kind of naivety, as though I had to come out of that with a book deal.
The way you just told it, the first moment when you thought you might be a writer by vocation was sitting in cafes in Lille, writing out what was happening to you.
Yeah.
That sense of freedom that you talk about, I mean, that's I hesitate to point this out, but it's a sort of familiar trope in the writings of African Americans about Europe. Du Bois talks about this in his autobiographies about arriving, in his case, in Germany, of course, and just realizing for the first time that not everybody was reacting to him as a black person.
That's right.
And maybe, is that part of the freedom?
That took me more years to realize or to fully be able to articulate. But one of my first experiences in Lille was I would often eat at kebab shops. And I remember walking into a kebab shop one late night and the man speaking to me in Arabic. And I kind of looked at him and he said, Parle arabe, speak Arabic. And I said, why? And he said, why didn't your parents teach you your language? And I said, what do you mean? He said, what are your origins? You often get asked in France, what are your origins?
Yes.
And I said, my dad's from Texas and my mom's from California. And he said, where are you from? Yes. And I said, I'm black. And he said, he looked at me with incredulity and he said, you're not black. Michael Jordan is black. And I really sat there and explained to him that, the one-drop rule and things like this. But that was the first time I realized that the way I think of myself is not necessarily, and it changes where I am, it's not necessarily what the society around me reflects back or interprets or sees.
Right. So and that happened in Lille. So that
happened in Lille. It was a very diverse part of France, and my phenotype looks more like the North African phenotype there. And so, but that was my first that was the first time I'd ever been mistaken for something other than what I thought I was, or my identity. Someone didn't accept my own self-definition, and it was also the first time that I realized that probably the most salient thing about me was my Americanness, not my racialness.
Right. Again, that's another thing that I think that
and that's Baldwin writes the best about this. Yeah,
I think Wright too.
That's right.
In Black Power. Richard Wright. So here you are. You're becoming a writer. You think, at least you're getting the qualifications of a young writer. You're acquiring an MFA or a master's degree in journalism or whatever it is. Do you already know what you're going to write about?
Not at all. Not at all. I was taking a course on polemical writing in my second semester. It's a 3-semester program, so it's a little bit odd. And the teacher's assignment, Professor Katie Royfey, her assignment was just to write anything that you want to write about, but just take a position and argue it forcefully. And so I was listening to all this Nina Simone, and I was really reading a lot of Baldwin at that time. And I was saying, why is this culture that I'm so immersed in right now so much richer than what I thought I had access to when I was growing up? And so I wrote a piece that was arguing that black culture in the hip-hop era, the post-civil rights era, isn't black culture, it's black street culture. It's been conflated with like a street identity that is a very narrow aspect of black culture. And she read the assignment and she said, this is pretty good, I think this could actually be published somewhere. And the beautiful thing about going to these graduate programs is that your professor actually knows somebody that they can give you the email to. And so I sent it to the New York Times, and they were interested. And then at some point they said that the news hook is not fresh enough, so wait until there's some news event. And out of frustration, I just went home and I just sent it blind to the Washington Post on their website, and they took it. And it ran, and it generated an enormous amount of comments, both for and against. And I said, I'd love to expand that argument because it was just about 800 words. And so
that's how the book.
So then my professor introduced me to an agent, and I took a semester off of school, and I worked on a proposal. And by the time I came back to finish my degree, I sold the book at auction. And I was naive enough to believe that's how writing works.
It'll happen every time.
But I approached it as though I knew that I didn't have any family money or anything to lean back on. So I knew that I had to actually support myself by my writing. And so I really approached it as though I had no option, but I couldn't even begin freelancing. I had to have a book.
Okay, so you have a contract and an outline, so you know what the book's about. And in fact, you have a published statement of the thesis.
And that's all I have to my name.
Book. Yeah. So you have to go somewhere and do this.
That's right.
So where do you go?
So initially I went back to my apartment that I was sharing with my long-term girlfriend from college. We had a bit of time off when I was in France, but through college in my early 20s. A woman who really taught me about the complexity of identity, too. She's a mixed girl. Her mother's family comes from the north of Italy, and her father's family comes from Nigeria. And she grew up in Inwood, above Washington Heights, around mostly Dominicans, looked Dominican, spoke Spanish fluently, and had this kind of identity that no one... what was projected on her was a Latina identity. And so she spoke Japanese, she had lived in Japan, and she identified as black. But my father's blackness was completely foreign to her, that southern variety of blackness. So she showed me that identities are really complex things, and she didn't even consider herself as having anything to do with Southern Italians who mostly populated the parts of Brooklyn that we lived in. She thought that was completely foreign.
Yes.
So I was living with her.
A widely shared view in Italy.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Unbeknownst to non-Italians.
Exactly.
Yes. So she's living her life, but you're living with her, and you're starting to write the thing.
And I'm starting to write, and we're beginning to grow apart, and we began to break up. And a friend of mine allowed me to borrow his apartment in Paris, and I went back to Paris, and I felt free again, and I banged out like 3 chapters in 6 weeks in Paris. I just felt energized. And so when I came back to New York, I no longer had my apartment with my girlfriend, and I had this amazing situation where you're paid up front for work that you'll complete a year later. And so I just, without knowing anything about it, I just got on a plane and went down to Buenos Aires and rented an apartment for a few months and just worked like I've never worked in my life, Yeah,
you say that in the book, and but you don't say very much about how. I mean, there are many. I would like to go and spend 3 months in Buenos Aires. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, it's a rather bold thing to do.
Especially considering I can't speak a word of Spanish, and you actually do need to. There's not like going to Paris.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there was an English-speaking community in
there was, but I just kind of
probably
on a leap
want
of
to hang out
faith,
with them.
I just It was such a, I was just obsessed with the literature of Borges and thought,
Okay, so was that really, in a way,
truly,
it was the literary
I was
connection.
either going to go to Mexico City because I was obsessed with Bolaño, or I was going to go to Buenos Aires because of Borges. Had a friend who had been living in both places.
You're a writer. Writers do things for that kind of reason. they go to places where they don't speak the language because there's a great writer who they admire who lived there. And that was, you did most of the finishing the book.
I did an enormous amount. I think, I got through much of the book there. And, it was one of those situations where you just didn't have to worry. I mean, it was a fraction of the price of living in Brooklyn, That's the true compensation of the writing life, is you get paid in freedom and you can do it where you want to do it.
Right. So then the book's done, comes out, you get these reactions. How do you end up as a permanent Frenchman?
I stumbled into that too. So when I was waiting for the book to come out, I was not yet sure how to really make it as a magazine journalist, and I took a job working for a French university, flying around the United States, kind of taking meetings with high-achieving American high school students and saying, have you ever thought about going and studying at Sciences Po? They have a program in English now.
Yes.
And it was a kind of a wonderful job, and I just traveled around, and I came to Paris a couple of times a year for that, and one time, through these friends that I had been making since when I graduated college, through when I was writing my book, I met up with some friends at a bar, and one of them brought my future wife along, and we just talked to each other for a couple of minutes, but kept in touch, and when she came to New York, things moved from there, and before I knew it, I was proposing to her, and she moved to New York for a year, and then I think we quickly realized that she's a writer as well, and two writers would do better off in a social democracy than in Brooklyn. Okay. So we moved to Paris.
Yes. Okay. And now you're, from the point of view of an American, you're a black man marrying a white woman.
That's right, and that was very much my point of view when I met her.
And that's, in a way, part of what happens when you get to France, is that you discover that isn't the only way people could think about it.
When I really began to live in France the second time, I was always struck that people didn't just accept as fact the one-drop logic that I thought was self-evident. So even before I had children, my wife is French, but I should say that, like my mother, she's blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned. And people would just ask, why do you say you're black? Why don't you say that you're mixed? Or there's many different ways you might describe yourself. Why is it just default black? I would explain to them the law of hypodescent, and then they would basically say, okay, but I noticed there was a kind of resistance to just buying into that I'd never noticed in the United States before.
Never?
Never, not really.
Nobody at Georgetown
people didn't. I had never even met somebody who identified as biracial until I was at Georgetown. And, you didn't even have the option of checking more than one box on the census until 2000.
That's right.
And my way of thought was very much aligned with what Barack Obama has very eloquently explained, was just that, were I not the president, were I doing something wrong, you would say there's a black guy doing something wrong. The world sees me as black, I'm black. I just checked the African-American box. That was very much my reasoning, too. And I found that I didn't really get a lot of resistance to that in America.
Right.
But, we got married in 2011. And by 2012, I was starting to realize that, if we have kids, my kids might, look pretty light. And so I wrote this op-ed in the New York Times, which in retrospect I think was kind of glib, but I wrote this op-ed arguing that my future children would be black, period.
Glib is fine for op-ed.
But I really believed it, or I was writing that op-ed for an audience of one, and I was the audience. I was convinced. I was arguing to myself publicly that your kids must be black, and it was a kind of moral obligation. And I was arguing it so often that I even kind of prevailed upon my wife to accept this view, even though it was very foreign to her European mindset. And so she said, "Okay, I'm gonna have black kids. That cool." And I kind of put that aside and bought myself several more months of unexamined life. And by the time that we actually ended up in the delivery room, I can honestly say that I walked into the delivery room one person and left a completely different person. And it's not because I had white children. It's because the presence of my blonde-haired, blue-eyed daughter, it shattered my ability to believe in the fiction of race. It thrust that fiction into my consciousness for the first time in a way that even living with a white mom and a black dad couldn't.
And do you think it would have been different if she just happened to have had a different throw of the genetic lottery and it had darker hair and
it might have been different.
eyes?
I think that it's the fact of knowing that she is 1/5, by 23andMe's logic, is 1/5 sub-Saharan African descended, and when we travel to visit friends in Sweden, passes as a local there. Yeah. It's that absurdity that shattered my belief not in our situation, but made me realize that these categories don't explain anybody's full complexity, but they're just most visible on the margins.
So you could have responded by saying, okay, I'm a black man with a white child.
Right.
Which is,
that was insufficient, I realized.
And then, so what completes the argument, and what's the argument? I mean, who are you now?
So
who are you? What's the position you're arguing us to trying to persuade us to let you occupy?
Sure. And trying to argue you to also perhaps join me in going to Occupy.
Yes. Well, all right, let's hear it and then we can...
This was not an overnight epiphany. My belief in the racial categories was deeply damaged. And my way of working through questions is to write about them. And so I wrote an essay for the Virginia Quarterly Review called Black and Blue and Blonde that was really, it was much more about, it was questions, it was not answers. And so I was wondering, what does it mean to change the race of a line of people? What does it mean to be the decision maker in a chain of decisions that actually steers the train off of one track onto another track? And I didn't know, but that essay was grappling with this kind of fear I was feeling. I felt like some kind of like modern Oedipus who had metaphorically slept with his white mother and slayed his black dad. I was wondering, what is the moral implication of that? What would it mean to have 20, 30 years down the line children and grandchildren that could potentially just toss off the comment among a room full of white people that, oh, I had black ancestry once upon a time. Isn't that funny? The way that some of my classmates used to talk about having Cherokee blood or something like that, where it has no emotional significance to them. It's a kind of funny quirk.
And also no cost.
And no cost. So that essay was grappling with those questions, and again, I realized that I didn't have enough space in that essay and I wanted to write a book, but I didn't know where the book would conclude. I wasn't having an argument yet. And I started reading a lot and thinking a lot, and I was reading Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields, which makes the brilliant argument that race functions in our society the way that witchcraft functioned in previous societies, where there's no such thing as witches, but you can die at the stake if you're perceived to be a witch.
Yes.
And that's the paradox of racism. And that racism creates race, not the other way around. That became a very fundamental insight through reading the Field Sisters.
Can I ask you a question? Because, I would have thought of that as a thought that you could have had if you'd been to the right classes at Georgetown.
That's right, but I was Hegel wasn't making those points. I was studying German idealism and things like this,
all right.
and existentialism.
You're right.
But
because that seems to me, in a way,
I could have approached that, but I
mean, there's been an argument in African American intellectual life for a long time about that question of sort of the priority of racism and race.
And even if I had paid more attention to Baldwin, he's making those points, and Albert Murray is making those points, and Ralph Ellison is making those points. And I went back and reread them, and I saw these points already. These arguments were already there.
But you had,
I hadn't.
You had new feelings about it because you had, because you had a daughter, and this is not a theoretical.
It became outside the realm of abstraction to me. It became very specific to me. And I read Paul Gilroy's Against Race, which I thought was astonishing. But none of that still got me to the point of really understanding how I would finish this book that was searching until I profiled in 2018 the artist, the conceptual artist and philosopher Adrian Piper, who,
by the way, I interviewed for the Village Voice.
Did you? You beat me to all of this. You did, though.
No. But so I was very interested to see that because, and in fact, the piece, the transition article that you quote was edited by my husband.
Oh, wow, really?
Who was one of the who persuaded her to write it, because I'm not sure she was going to.
It's an absolutely brilliant, passing for black, passing for white.
Yes, and it's got great images in it too.
Yes. It was. It was an astonishing piece for me to read. Adrian Piper is a woman who had black ancestry on both sides of her family, but her father was so light that he could pass in the military, and he received 2 birth certificates in his infancy. The first said he was white, and the second said he was an octoroon, on his mother's insistence that he wouldn't have a white birth certificate. But many people didn't know what to make out of Adrian. Her whole life, blacks questioned her blackness, and whites could get very enraged when they found out that she was black and feel that she had tricked them in elite spaces like Harvard's philosophy department.
So she's a graduate student at Harvard.
Exactly.
In philosophy.
And Quine comes up to her and says, "You're about as black as I am." And this shatters her idea of Harvard as being a place where these kind of questions wouldn't interfere with the life of the mind. But, in 2012, she did this art gesture. She publicly retired from being black.
Yes.
And when I read that, I was just astonished by this, and I wanted to write about her. And she wasn't interested in doing much press, but after about 2 months of going back and forth in emails and having increasingly interesting conversations with her, I went and I met her twice in Berlin, and we had these long conversations. And something in talking to her opened up, it released something in me, and she gave me kind of, she wouldn't say that she gave me permission, but her example gave me permission to say that, you know what, I want to step out of this kind of perverse all-American skin game that operates on this idea that there's a white-black binary that's real, and that monolithic whiteness that lumps Jews, sometimes even Arabs, Anglo-Saxons, Italians together, as opposed to this permanent black underclass. I want to step out of that system, and I want to question it, and I want my children to be the type of people that subvert that don't just easily blend into monolithic whiteness. And I said to her when we were having dinner, but the thing that gives me pause and that kind of scares me is I think that maybe my children won't have this kind of ancestral pain and guilt that I think attaches me to a community, and I'm wondering that that's a form of disloyalty if they were to lose that. And she said, look, if they don't have to be burdened by guilt, why would you want to burden them by guilt? They can be loyal, they can be respectful, they can know who they are, where they come from, but isn't the point of struggle to at some point not have to struggle anymore?
Right.
I'd never heard anybody ever say that. I'd never had a conversation where somebody just so straightforwardly questioned something that I assumed to be a necessity.
But you're asking, so you're saying you're retiring from blackness. There's a retirement home somewhere where you and Adrian Piper are retiring.
Well, I would say not just from blackness, but from race.
Retiring from race. But what I was going to say, that means that you're also trying to raise your kids not as white kids.
That's absolutely right. It would be a tragedy if they.
So, and I guess we have like 5 minutes left, but so the real practical challenge is what's possible for you and what's possible for your now 2 children, and maybe your brother and his half-Russian children, is going to depend on what other people do. You can't do this on your own. So in other words, the book is an appeal to the rest of us in a way to say, at the very minimum, don't require me and my children to be in this game. But in a way, you're suggesting that all of us would be better off if we left the game of race.
I think that our society would be much healthier if we did.
And the response, of course, is going to be from some people that there's a risk there of leaving behind the worst off black people who need blackness as the one thing they've got to create solidarity and resistance to what is still a pretty racist society and maybe a pretty racist world. I don't know. What's your? I mean, so
yeah, sure.
I mean, and frankly, most of the people are thinking about when they think that that's going to be a useful thing that you're denying them. Most of them aren't going to read your book. They're not in the business of making this kind of argument or responding to this kind of argument. So I guess somebody's going to have to make it for them. I mean, so what's your view about that? What's your sense of the best case, as it were, for the other side? I'm a philosopher. I like to know what the best case is for the opposition.
Sure. So I think that Americans do race very sloppily and very badly. Oftentimes, when we're talking about race, we're really talking about ethnicity and class and culture and things like this. I don't think that subverting and resisting racial categorization means that you have to lose touch with your community or with the cultural traditions that matter to you. So that's off the bat. I think that black people and people rendered non-white in this society have the least incentive out there to uphold the racecraft that keeps the whole thing going. Right. This book is very much, I think oftentimes it gets misconstrued as an argument against blackness. This book is very much an appeal for whites who are necessary in this. It can't happen without sufficient numbers of well-meaning white people subverting their own whiteness and rejecting their own whiteness, understanding how their race has been made, and then achieving a perspective that resists that racial identity.
Right.
So it's an appeal to whites to reject race.
And how, in practice, are they to do that?
So I think there's a few ways. One of the things you can do right off the bat would be to treat language as though it really matters. I think that many of us think that language simply describes reality, but language actually creates reality. The word choices we make matter, and they create the world that we inhabit. So you might stop saying that you're white, and you might get a much more specific conception of who you are, where your mother's family comes from, where your father's family comes from. You might take seriously some genealogical research. You might actually do some DNA research, and most people that dig far enough will find things that contradict their simplistic conception of themselves, and you might incorporate that into your idea of who you are. On one hand, have a hyper-specific sense of yourself, and on the other hand, you might actually just have a much more universal sense of yourself and say, racially, I'm a member of the human race. People will laugh at you when you say that, but it's actually the most accurate way you could describe yourself.
Yes. I'm not sure everybody will laugh at you, but it seems to me that there is... you mentioned that when you made the argument against certain features of hip-hop culture, it turned out that there were African Americans who were going to go along for the ride. I suspect that I hope that you're finding that there are people everywhere.
There are.
Who want to do this, and I'm just the challenge. I think is that racial identities, like all identities, are made by all of us together.
That's right.
And so it's going to be a team effort. And while you don't have to bring everybody along, for it to work, we have to bring an awful lot of people
That's
along.
right. You need sufficient numbers for norms to change, but norms can and do change.
Yes.
And I don't think that you can actually just stumble by accident into a better future that you can't first envision.
Right.
So I think there's an element of imaginative labor that does have to happen before, when it seems like a long shot. I mean, James Baldwin, a quote that really means a lot to me, is he said that we have to defeat the racial delusion. I'm paraphrasing him. He said, I'm asking the impossible, but we owe our children nothing less than the impossible.
Right.
And race is a delusion, and we have to defeat all delusions.
And you're going back to France?
On Saturday.
Saturday?
I'm going back shortly.
That's home now?
That's home for now.
And what's the next book?
That's a good question. It's not going to be another memoir. I think my father's going to be really upset if I do a third memoir before the age of 40.
So it's a novel, perhaps?
I have a novel that I shelved.
You said you were working
novel.
on a novel. You say in the book.
And it didn't come together the way I want. So maybe I'll try a new novel, or what I think I might want to do is step outside of myself and get into some reporting.
Terrific. Well, we've stepped out of our time, so we're at the end of the time available. So it's been very good talking to you. And I wish you all the best with this book and with the project of helping us all, perhaps, to escape from race.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good.